You know, it really strikes you sometimes how different childhood is now compared to, well, even just a decade or two ago.
Oh, absolutely.
Kids are juggling school, all the after-school stuff, and then there's this constant digital world layered on top.
Hmm.
And if you're trying to help a child navigate all that, trying to help them develop a sense of, calm and resilience, it can feel like a real uphill battle in today's environment.
It really can. We hear it all the time, don't we? From
No.
parents, from teachers, therapists. They're seeing kids struggle more with managing big emotions or staying focused or even just bouncing back from small setbacks.
Yeah.
And these are really the core components of self-regulation. The world we live in now, it offers so much, but it also throws up some, let's say, unique obstacles for nurturing these skills.
Okay, so let's dig into that because that's pretty much exactly what we're exploring today, isn't it? We're
Mhm.
taking a closer look at how this really packed, constantly stimulating world can make it harder for kids to learn how to self-regulate. And we're using some really great insights from issue #2 self-regulation in a busy world by your therapy source. That's our guide for this.
Exactly. And it's such a helpful resource because it really clarifies that self-regulation isn't just about like behaving well.
Right, it's deeper than that.
Much deeper. It's a whole set of abilities.
Hmm.
Handling those big feelings, being able to shift your attention when you need to, resisting those immediate impulses,
Uh-huh.
and crucially, recovering when things don't go according to plan, bouncing back.
And kids aren't just like born knowing how to do all this stuff, are they?
No, definitely not. It's something that develops as their brains mature. And like any skill, really, it takes practice. Lots of it.
So our mission today, if you like, is to really try and understand what specific things in modern life can, well, interfere with this development and maybe get some insights into how we can all be a bit more helpful.
That's the plan. And, to really get a handle on how these modern factors play out, it's useful to think about self-regulation not as one single thing, but as something supported by a whole network in the brain and body.
Ah, right. Like a team effort inside us.
Precisely. The issue actually outlines 9 key areas that are involved.
Yeah, I saw that. It's almost like understanding the different sections of an orchestra, maybe. They all need to work together.
That's a great analogy.
Can we just quickly touch on what those 9 areas are and sort of their main jobs?
Sure, let's do a quick run through. First up, you've got sensory input and initial filtering. Think thalamus and the reticular activating system.
Okay.
These are basically sorting through all the information coming in from our senses, sights, sounds, everything, and deciding what's important enough to pay attention to, kind of like a spam filter.
Got it. Spam filter for the senses. I like that. Then threat detection and emotional response. That sounds like the amygdala's job.
You got it. The amygdala is like the brain's quick reaction alarm system. It spots potential threats and triggers those immediate emotional responses: fight, flight, freeze.
Okay. Essential, but maybe easily triggered sometimes.
Potentially, yes. Then there's contextual processing, which
Yeah.
brings to the hippocampus.
Ah, memory.
Exactly. The hippocampus helps us understand what's happening now by relating it to past experiences and memories. It gives context and meaning to events.
Okay. And then body regulation, keeping things stable.
That's mainly the hypothalamus. It's like the body's internal thermostat, managing hunger, sleep, energy levels, stress hormones,
Mhm.
keeping everything in balance.
Right. Then moving up to the front, the prefrontal cortex.
The CEO, right?
That's the one.
Uh,
Handles the executive functions planning, making decisions, controlling impulses, thinking things through. Really crucial for deliberate self-regulation.
Makes sense. And it's not just thinking. Movement's involved too. Motor planning and coordination. Yes, the basal ganglia and cerebellum. They help us move smoothly, coordinate actions, and even just be aware of our body in space. This actually contributes to feeling grounded and well-regulated.
Interesting. Okay, so after the alarm bells and the action, we need to calm down.
And that's where the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system come in. They act like the body's brakes, helping us shift out of stress mode and into that rest and digest state, calming everything down.
The breaks, good analogy. And then the social piece, social connection and empathy.
Yep, relies heavily on mirror neurons. These amazing cells help us understand and even sort of feel what others are feeling, key for empathy and connecting.
Wow. Okay, last one, self-reflection and mindfulness.
This involves a network called the default mode network. It's active when our mind is wandering, daydreaming, reflecting internally. Super important for self-awareness, understanding our own thoughts and feelings.
Okay, that's quite a team. It really shows how complex self-regulation is.
It really is. And the key point, as the issue highlights, is that these systems are all interconnected. So if one area gets thrown off balance, maybe it's overstimulated or underused, it can really ripple out and disrupt the whole network.
Right. Which brings us neatly to one of the biggest players in modern life,
Yeah.
technology and screen time.
Ah, yes, the big one. And as the issue points out, one major concern is how excessive screen time can overstimulate the brain's reward pathway, the dopamine system.
That pleasure chemical.
Exactly. That constant drip, drip, drip of dopamine from screens can make it harder for kids to manage impulses and regulate their emotions when they're not getting that intense stimulation like in everyday real-world situations.
And the research seems to back this up pretty strongly, doesn't it? The issue mentions a big review of studies. What did
But,
that find?
well, one of the clearer findings was about early exposure. More screen time in infancy, those first couple of years, seems linked to poorer self-regulation skills later on.
Mm.
Now, for older kids, it gets a bit more nuanced. It seems to depend more on what they're watching and the context around it.
Okay.
But a really consistent finding was about background TV, just having it on, even if the child isn't actively watching. That was associated with reduced self-regulation.
Wow, even background noise.
Yeah. And also, really fantastical, high-stimulation content seems to have more immediate negative effects on their ability to regulate right after watching.
It's like that constant barrage of visuals and sounds just overwhelms a developing brain, maybe. Makes it harder to tune into less intense things.
That could definitely be part of it. And then there was that fascinating study by Dr. Heffler looking at early screen use and how kids process sensory information later.
Yes, tell us about that.
Well, Dr. Heffler's work found a link between more screen exposure in the first 2 years and what they called atypical sensory processing. So kids might be less responsive to sensations or more easily overwhelmed by them, or they might constantly seek out really intense sensory input.
So, if their basic way of experiencing the world through their senses is different, it's easy to see how that could impact self-regulation, right? If you're constantly feeling bombarded or maybe underwhelmed by your environment.
Exactly. Managing your responses, your emotions, your attention, that's going to be way harder.
Yeah.
And another study by Cerniglia and colleagues adds another piece. They found that kids with higher screen time at age 4 showed more difficulties with emotional regulation and had lower math and literacy skills by age 8.
Wow. So there are potential knock-on effects for learning, too.
It seems so. It shows how these early patterns can have longer-term consequences.
And there was that study Fitzpatrick et al., I think. It showed a kind of cycle happening.
Yes, that one suggested a potential feedback loop. More tablet use around age 3.5 was linked to kids showing more anger and frustration about a year later.
Okay.
And then, those higher levels of anger and frustration seem to predict even more tablet use by age 5.5.
Oh, wow. So the screen becomes the go-to coping mechanism, maybe. But
Yeah.
it doesn't actually help them learn to manage the feeling itself.
That's the concern, yes. It might soothe in the moment, but it doesn't build the underlying skill.
Right. So knowing all this, let's connect it back to those 9 areas. How does too much screen time actually mess with each of those systems? The issue breaks this down really well.
It does. Okay, let's start with the thalamus and reticular activating system, the sensory filters.
Right.
The sheer volume and speed of information from screens can just overwhelm them. It makes it harder to filter effectively and can keep the reticular activating system kind of constantly on alert.
So the brain gets used to that high level of input and then struggles with quieter activity.
That's the idea. It
Yeah.
recalibrates in a way. Now, the amygdala, the emotional alarm,
Yeah.
the fast pace, the often intense emotional content on screens, it can make the amygdala more reactive. So kids might have bigger emotional blow-ups in real life over smaller things because their system is primed for that higher level of stimulation,
Everything else feels kind of boring or frustrating by comparison.
potentially. And the hippocampus, the memory keeper.
What happens there?
Well, screen content is often quite passive and lacks that rich, multi-sensory, real-world context. So it might not lead to forming those deep, detailed memories that help us learn and, importantly, recall calming or successful coping experiences from the past.
Ah, so when they're stressed, they might have fewer positive, I handled this before memories to draw on.
Exactly. Fewer internal resources to self-soothe than the hypothalamus regulating the body.
Sleep disruption comes to mind immediately.
Big time. Screen time, especially near bed, messes with melatonin and sleep cycles. Poor sleep puts major stress on the hypothalamus, making it harder to regulate energy, mood, and stress responses during the day.
So they're tired, possibly more stressed just from being tired. Not a good recipe for self-regulation.
Definitely not.
Okay.
The prefrontal cortex, the CEO.
How does instant gratification affect that?
Well, screens offer constant, immediate rewards and feedback. This can basically train the prefrontal cortex to expect that instant gratification. So, delaying impulses, sticking with challenging tasks that don't offer quick rewards, that becomes much harder.
Seems like we're accidentally training their browns against the kind of patient self-regulation requires.
In a way, yes. And the basal ganglia and cerebellum, the movement centers.
Less movement, obviously.
Right. All that time sitting still means less time for the physical exploration and activity that develops coordination, balance, body awareness, and that physical grounding actually contributes to feeling more settled emotionally, too.
So getting them moving is really key. What about the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system? The calming system.
Constant engagement with screens tends to keep us in a state of alertness, even if it's low level. It prevents that full activation of the parasympathetic rest and digest system.
So the brakes don't get fully applied.
They don't get the chance to, or not as often.
Yeah.
So kids might find it harder to genuinely relax and recover from stress. They stay kind of revved up.
Okay. And the social part, the mirror neurons.
Screens mean less face-to-face interaction, right? And digital interactions, while connecting in one way, just don't provide the same rich, nuanced, real-time feedback, the micro-expressions, the body language that really fire up those mirror neurons and help build empathy.
So less practice reading people in real life.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Less raw data for building social understanding. And finally, the default mode network, the reflection zone. Screens keep our attention focused outward. The default mode network thrives on downtime, on letting the mind wander inward. Constant screen engagement drastically cuts into that time, hindering self-reflection, daydreaming, and just processing internal states.
Wow, it really paints a picture of how pervasive the impact of excessive screen time can be across the board for self-regulation.
It really does, but the issue isn't just about doom and gloom. It offers practical ideas too, setting limits, creating tech-free times or zones, modeling our own healthy tech habits.
Yeah, those are really important takeaways. It's not about banning screens entirely, obviously, but finding that balance, using them intentionally so they don't crowd out all these other crucial developmental experiences.
Precisely. Making sure there's space for everything else that helps build those strong self-regulation foundations.
Okay, so that's the tech piece. Huge. But let's shift gears. Another really interesting, maybe slightly more controversial point the issue raises is the impact of, well, over-involved parenting.
Ah, yes. The helicopter or maybe now lawnmower parent idea.
Right. Stepping in too quickly, clearing every obstacle. How does that affect self-regulation?
Well, it's a really tricky balance, isn't it? Because it comes from a place of love and wanting to protect your child.
Of course.
But the research suggests that when parents consistently jump in and prevent kids from facing and managing challenges themselves, it can actually limit their opportunities to learn problem solving, build resilience, cope with frustration, all vital for self-regulation.
And there was a study mentioned, Perry et al., that tracked kids over time.
Yes, that was quite telling. They found that parenting rated as over-controlling when kids were just 2 years old was linked to weaker emotional regulation and poorer inhibitory control, that ability to stop and think by age 5.
Wow, that early.
Yes. And importantly, those difficulties at age 5 then predicted a greater likelihood of emotional problems, behavioral issues, and even social difficulties later in childhood.
That's a significant long-term ripple effect. It's like by trying to smooth the path too much, we might inadvertently prevent them from developing their own internal toolkit for navigating bumps in the road.
That's a good way to put it. And it doesn't just stop in early childhood. There was another study mentioned, Moilanen and Manu, looking at helicopter parenting in young adulthood.
Okay, what did that find?
They found that young adults who reported experiencing higher levels of helicopter parenting tended to have lower self-regulation skills, a weaker sense of personal mastery, like feeling they could actually influence things in their own lives,
Right.
and also lower social competence and higher rates of depression. And interestingly, the researchers suggested that self-regulation was a key pathway linking that parenting style to those poorer outcomes.
So even in young adulthood, that pattern of over-involvement can undermine the development of independence and the very skills needed to cope with life, which then affects well-being. It's really something to think about.
It really is.
So let's do the same thing again. How does this over-involvement play out across those 9 areas?
Okay, let's start with sensory input and filtering again. If parents are always managing the environment or shielding kids from anything potentially uncomfortable or challenging, kids get less practice tuning things out or coping with different sensory inputs themselves. They might rely on the adult to be the filter, potentially making them more sensitive or easily overwhelmed when they do have to manage on their own.
So their own internal filter doesn't get as strong. What about the amygdala, the alarm system?
If they haven't had many chances to navigate tricky situations independently, their amygdala might become more easily triggered by stress later on. Minor challenges might feel like major threats because they haven't built that confidence through experience.
It's like the threat threshold is lower because they haven't practiced handling things.
That's one way to think about it, yes. Less resilience built up. Now, the hippocampus, memory and context.
Fewer memories of solving problems themselves.
Exactly. The hippocampus learns from doing. If parents always step in, kids miss out on encoding those powerful memories of, I faced a challenge and I figured it out. They have fewer personal success stories to draw on, which can impact confidence and future problem solving.
Makes sense. And the hypothalamus, body regulation.
Constantly being shielded from everyday stressors
Yeah.
means less practice for the hypothalamus in managing the body's stress response, regulating heart rate, cortisol levels, etc. They might develop a lower tolerance for stress because their system hasn't had those workouts.
So they might have a harder time physically recovering from stressful events. What about the CEO, the prefrontal cortex?
Decision making. This part of the brain grows through making choices, weighing options, experiencing consequences. If parents make all the decisions or micromanage tasks, the prefrontal cortex just doesn't get those crucial reps needed to develop strong executive functions and self-regulation around choices.
You need to exercise the decision muscle, right?
Precisely. And the basal ganglia and cerebellum for movement and coordination. How does that fit? It might seem less direct, but think about practical independence.
Yeah.
If parents consistently do things for kids that they could be learning to do themselves, tying shoes, packing a bag, managing their belongings,
Yeah.
kids miss out on developing not just the motor skills, but also that sense of physical competence and self-sufficiency. Feeling capable in your body contributes to overall regulation.
That feeling of, I can manage my stuff. Okay. And the calming system, the vagus nerve and parasympathetic nervous system.
Kids need chances to feel upset and then figure out how to calm themselves down. If a parent always rushes in to fix the problem or provide immediate comfort, the child might not develop their own internal strategies for self-soothing.
So they become more reliant on external comfort.
Potentially, yes. Less practiced at activating their own internal brakes. What about social skills? Mirror neurons.
If parents are always mediating playdates or resolving squabbles.
Right. Kids miss valuable opportunities to navigate those social complexities themselves. Reading cues, understanding perspectives, negotiating. This limits the experiences that help tune those mirror neurons for empathy and social understanding.
They don't get the raw data from navigating tricky social stuff firsthand.
Exactly. And finally, the default mode network for self-reflection.
Less need to think for themselves if someone else is always directing.
Kind of. With constant guidance and problem solving from parents, there are fewer of those natural pauses where a child might reflect on their own thoughts, feelings, actions, choices. That internal check-in, which the DMN supports, happens less.
Wow. So again, even though it comes from a good place, over-involvement seems to touch every single one of these areas needed for self-regulation.
It can, yes. And the issue, again, offers constructive ways forward, encouraging independence, offering support without solving, letting natural consequences happen within safe limits, of course.
It's about finding that balance between support and letting them learn through doing.
Exactly. Scaffolding, not carrying.
Okay, so we've covered tech and overparenting. What's next on the list of modern challenges? Overscheduling. Kids' calendars looking like CEOs.
Oh, yes. Back-to-back activities, tutoring, sports, music, very little unscheduled time.
And the issue highlights how this constant go-go-go state really limits the brain's chance to get into that rest and digest mode, right?
Absolutely. That parasympathetic state we talked about. Without sufficient downtime, kids can end up in a state of chronic low-level stress, which impacts focus, resilience, and overall emotional regulation.
And there was research mentioned, Cayetano et al., that suggested more isn't always better when it comes to enrichment activities.
That's right. It was quite interesting. They found that piling on structured activities beyond a certain point didn't necessarily boost cognitive skills, like reading or math. But it could actually lead to a decline in non-cognitive skills, things like emotional well-being, behavior, self-esteem, especially for older kids. And often, these extra activities were crowding out essentials like sleep, family time, social time, and critically unstructured play.
So you could actually be making things worse for their overall well-being by trying to pack too much in. That's counterintuitive for many people.
It can be. And then the Barker et al. Study added another layer, looking specifically at structured versus unstructured time.
What did that show?
It found that children who spent more time in less structured activities, things like free play, just hanging out, creative pursuits, actually showed stronger self-directed executive functioning.
Meaning they were better at managing themselves without external direction.
Exactly. Planning, initiating, managing their own actions. Conversely, more time spent in highly structured activities was linked to weaker self-directed executive function.
That really underlines the value of just letting kids have time to figure things out for themselves, doesn't it? For building those internal skills.
It really does. That unstructured time is incredibly valuable development time.
So, how does being constantly scheduled impact our 9 areas? Let's run through them again. Thalamus and reticular activating system. Sensory overload.
Definitely. Constant transitions between different environments, different demands. It can overwhelm the filtering system.
Yeah.
And the reticular activating system, controlling alertness, might just stay chronically activated. There's no off switch.
Just perpetually hard to settle. What about the amygdala, the emotional hub?
A packed schedule can keep the amygdala on higher alert, constantly adapting to new demands, rushing, maybe worrying about being late or performing. It's inherently stressful. Without adequate downtime to recover, emotional sensitivity can increase.
So, more prone to meltdowns or frustration because they're just depleted.
That's a real risk. And the hippocampus, memory and learning.
Not enough time to process things.
Exactly. The hippocampus needs time to consolidate experiences, to make connections. Rushing from one thing to the next means experiences might remain superficial, not fully processed or stored in a meaningful way. Learning might be less deep.
Okay. And the hypothalamus, body regulation?
Sleep often takes a hit with overscheduling, irregular bedtimes, maybe less sleep overall. This puts a huge strain on the hypothalamus. Fatigue, difficulty managing energy levels, increased stress hormones are all likely consequences.
So again, tired and stressed. Bad combo. Prefrontal cortex, the CEO.
It thrives on self-directed practice. When a child's entire day is mapped out by adults, they get far fewer opportunities to make their own choices, manage their own time, solve unexpected problems, or practice regulating themselves in unstructured situations.
They're not getting to practice being the CEO of their own time and actions.
Not nearly as much.
Yeah.
And the basal ganglia and cerebellum movement, well, they might be doing scheduled sports, which is great for some aspects, but overscheduling often crowds out spontaneous, self-directed free play. And it's in that kind of play that kids often develop motor skills, coordination, and body awareness in a really natural exploratory way.
So they miss out on that organic physical learning.
Wow.
Okay, vagus nerve and parasympathetic system, the calming breaks.
Just not enough time to engage them fully. Constant activity, even enjoyable activity, keeps the sympathetic go system more active. There are fewer moments to truly relax, let the body recover, and activate that rest and digest response.
The body stays in a kind of low-level go mode.
Pretty much. And social connection and empathy, the mirror neurons. When interactions are always within structured activities, they might be more task-focused, pass the ball, wait your turn. There might be less opportunity for the kind of relaxed, reciprocal, open-ended social engagement where empathy and deeper connection really flourish.
So quantity of interaction, maybe, but not necessarily quality for building those deeper social skills.
It's a possibility. And finally, the default mode network. Reflection time, drastically reduced. A packed schedule keeps the brain focused externally on the next task, the next place to be. There's very little mental space left for that internal wandering, daydreaming, processing feelings, reflecting on experiences, all the things the DMN is for.
So it seems overscheduling, just like the others, really puts a strain on the whole self-regulation network.
It absolutely does. And again, the solution isn't necessarily no activities, but finding a sustainable balance. Prioritizing downtime, protecting sleep, maybe even embracing boredom sometimes.
Saying no to some things might actually be saying yes to well-being.
That's a great way to think about it. Allowing space is crucial.
Okay, we need to touch on a couple more big factors mentioned in the issue. What about high expectations and academic pressure? That feels very relevant today.
Hugely relevant. The pressure to achieve, to perform, to get into the right schools, it starts so early now. And the issue points out how this constant striving can lead to chronic stress, which directly impacts those brain areas involved in self-regulation.
Yeah, the link between academic pressure and things like anxiety, depression, even burnout in kids, that research is pretty sobering.
It really is. Studies have shown this connection quite clearly. There was one mentioned looking at middle schoolers in affluent suburbs.
Luther and Becker.
That's the one. It linked high achievement pressure directly to significant emotional distress, like anxiety and depression, even substance use, sometimes at higher rates than in low-income urban youth.
Wow, that really challenges some assumptions. So how does this constant pressure impact the 9 areas? Thalamus and reticular activating system, always scanning for threats.
Kind of. They might be constantly filtering for cues related to performance, judgment, potential failure. This keeps the alertness system overstimulated, making it hard to relax or focus on non-academic things.
Hypervigilant about performance. And the amygdala.
Likely sensitized. It might react more strongly to perceived failures or setbacks, leading to heightened emotional responses like anxiety, frustration, or shame around academic challenges.
So mistakes feel like catastrophes. What about the hippocampus and learning? Isn't pressure supposed to motivate learning?
Well, moderate stress can enhance memory, but chronic stress, the kind from relentless pressure, actually inhibits the hippocampus. It can make it harder to process and retain new information effectively, so too much pressure can actually backfire on learning.
That's crucial. And the hypothalamus. Stress hormones.
Constantly elevated cortisol levels. This disrupts sleep, affects energy regulation, and can have long-term health implications. The body's basically stuck in a prolonged stress response.
Exhausting. Prefrontal cortex. Decision-making, impulse control.
Chronic stress leads to mental fatigue. This reduces the prefrontal cortex's capacity to manage impulses, make thoughtful decisions, and sustain focus. Kids might be more impulsive or struggle with tasks requiring concentration.
Too mentally drained to regulate effectively. What about movement? Basal ganglia and cerebellum.
Pressure often means less time and energy for physical activity or play. Kids might be sedentary, studying, or too stressed to engage physically, impacting motor skills and that sense of physical well-being.
And the calming system. Vagus nerve and parasympathetic.
Just like with overscheduling, chronic stress prevents this system from fully engaging. The body stays in that alert, sympathetic dominant state, making relaxation and recovery difficult.
Always braced for the next demand. Mirror neurons and social connection.
Intense focus on individual achievement can sometimes come at the expense of collaborative or purely social interaction. Empathy and connection might take a backseat to competition or comparison.
And the default mode network. Reflection.
Again, reduced opportunity. When the focus is constantly external on grades, tasks, expectations, there's left mental space for internal reflection on emotions, values, or just letting the mind rest.
So high pressure, like the other factors, creates this system-wide strain that undermines self-regulation.
Exactly. It's a pervasive stressor.
Okay, closely related to depression, especially in the digital age, is constant social comparison. That feels like another huge one.
Oh, enormous. Especially with social media. The issue highlights how it fosters this reliance on external validation, likes, comments, followers, and constant comparison with often curated, unrealistic portrayals of others' lives.
And the research links this directly to mental health issues, right?
Yes, definitely. Studies mentioned in the issue link technology-based social comparison to increased depressive symptoms, especially in adolescents. Another linked higher daily digital tech use to increased symptoms of things like ADHD and conduct disorder, along with poorer self-regulation.
Wow.
And more time on social media has been associated with higher depression, potentially due to things like online harassment, poor sleep from late-night use, and lower self-esteem fueled by comparison.
It's a minefield. And some studies even looked at brain responses.
Yes, fascinating work showing that seeing popular posts on platforms like Instagram can trigger reward centers in the brain, similar to other rewarding stimuli. But viewing risky images online can actually reduce activity in cognitive control regions.
So it primes reward seeking and potentially lowers impulse control.
And, perhaps most concerning, habitual checking of social media might be linked to longer-term changes in brain networks involved in emotion, motivation, and control. It's potentially reshaping brain function over time.
That's quite profound. So the 9 areas again, how does social comparison hit them? Thalamus RAS, overload from feeds.
Yes, the sheer speed and volume of input from social media feeds can overwhelm sensory processing. Constant novelty keeps the alertness system highly stimulated.
Always something new flashing up. Amygdala, triggered by social threats.
Absolutely. Fear of missing out, FOMO, feeling excluded, seeing negative comments, comparing oneself unfavorably. These can all be perceived as social threats, triggering the amygdala and leading to anxiety, envy, or sadness.
A constant stream of potential social triggers. Hippocampus, memory.
Social media interactions tend to be superficial, fleeting. They might not build the kind of deep, meaningful social memories that contribute to a stable sense of self and belonging. Context gets lost.
Less depth, more scrolling. Hypothalamus, the need for validation.
That constant seeking of likes and external approval can keep the stress response system activated. Cortisol might rise with the anxiety of posting or the disappointment of not getting expected feedback.
A roller coaster driven by external feedback. Prefrontal cortex, impulse control.
Social media trains the brain for immediate feedback loops and quick hits of validation. This can undermine the prefrontal cortex's ability to delay gratification and exert impulse control in other areas of life. Plus, the constant distraction hinders focus.
Training for distraction and instant reward again. Basal ganglia cerebellum. Movement.
Similar to general screen time, it often replaces physical activity and real-world exploration, impacting motor development and body awareness.
Right. Vagus nerve parasympathetic, calming down.
Hard to activate when you're constantly anticipating the next notification, comparing yourself, or feeling anxious about online interactions. The body stays in a state of preparedness, not rest.
Always waiting for the ping. Mirror neurons. Empathy.
Online interactions lack the richness of face-to-face cues. It's harder to truly read emotions or develop deep empathy. Comparison often trumps connection.
Comparing rather than connecting. And the default mode network. Reflection.
Constantly engaging with external social feeds leaves very little room for the internal reflection the DMN enables. It's hard to be mindful or self-aware when your attention is perpetually drawn outwards.
So another factor deeply impacting the entire self-regulation system. It's quite a list we've built up.
It is, and they often interact and overlap, of course.
Absolutely. Which leads us to the final point the issue emphasizes. The impact of just reduced opportunities for downtime. The simple lack of quiet, unstructured time.
Yes. The flip side of overscheduling and constant digital engagement. This lack of quiet space weakens the ability to practice self-soothing, reduces self-awareness, and generally undermines the foundation of self-regulation.
And research supports the positive impact of downtime and less structured time.
It does. One study, Fitzpatrick, again, found higher screen time at 3.5 years, predicted lower effortful control, a key aspect of self-regulation a year later. Less screen time, more potential for downtime.
Okay.
Another study, Colliver et al., found that more unstructured play, both quiet and active, in early childhood, predicted stronger self-regulation skills 2 years later.
So that just playing is actually serious work for development.
Absolutely critical work. And then there's research on mindfulness, which is essentially cultivating intentional downtime for the mind. Reviews show mindfulness interventions can improve executive function, attention, and emotional regulation in kids.
And mindfulness is linked to better emotional recovery, too.
Yes. Research suggests it helps people regulate their emotions more effectively and bounce back from distressing experiences more quickly. It builds that internal capacity.
So how does the lack of downtime affect our 9 areas? Last run through. Thalamus RAS. No rest for the filters.
Pretty much. A constant stream of input, without breaks, keeps these systems perpetually on. They don't get a chance to reset, leading to that feeling of being overwhelmed or constantly needing stimulation.
Always needing input. Amygdala.
Stays more reactive. Without periods of calm and safety where it can stand down, it remains more easily triggered by stressors. Downtime helps reset the sensitivity level.
Less chance to dial down the alarm. Hippocampus. Consolidation time.
Missed opportunities. Downtime is when the hippocampus consolidates learning, integrates experiences, and forms coherent memories. Without it, learning can be fragmented, and positive experiences might not sink in as deeply.
So experiences don't get fully processed. Hypothalamus. Stress regulation.
Lack of rest keeps cortisol levels potentially elevated. The hypothalamus struggles to regulate energy and maintain balance without those recovery periods. Chronic fatigue and stress can result.
The body doesn't get to fully recharge. Prefrontal cortex. Reflective thinking.
Downtime allows for the kind of slower, reflective thinking the prefrontal cortex excels at. Without it, thinking tends to be more reactive, impulsive. Practicing deliberate self-control requires that mental space.
Less chance for thoughtful control. Basal ganglia cerebellum. Mindful movement.
Downtime isn't just about sitting still. It can involve calm, intentional movement, or just quiet awareness of the body. Lack of downtime means fewer opportunities for this kind of grounding physical presence.
Less body awareness. Vagus nerve parasympathetic. Activating the brakes.
This system needs periods of quiet and safety to fully engage. Constant busyness keeps the body in a mild state of alert, preventing the deep relaxation and restoration the parasympathetic system provides.
The brakes never get fully engaged. Mirror neurons and empathy.
Self-awareness, which is nurtured during downtime, is actually foundational for empathy. It's hard to understand others' internal states if you're disconnected from your own. The lack of downtime hinders that internal connection.
You need to understand yourself to understand others. Makes sense. And finally, default mode network.
This network is downtime, essentially. When we lack unstructured time, the DMN is less active. This means reduced self-reflection, less integration of experiences, perhaps even less creativity.
So lacking downtime really starves the brain of essential processing time.
It really does. It's not empty time, it's crucial processing time.
This has been such an incredibly insightful, if slightly sobering, look at how our modern world really does stack the deck against kids developing self-regulation skills.
It presents significant challenges, that's for sure.
Yeah, connecting all these factors, screens, over-involvement, packed schedules, pressure, comparison, lack of quiet to those specific brain and body systems really clarifies the impact.
Understanding those mechanisms is so important for anyone supporting children, parents, educators, therapists, all of us.
Absolutely, because once we understand how these things interfere, we can be more intentional about mitigating them, right?
Right.
Creating more balance.
Exactly. It's about making conscious choices to carve out space for connection, for independence, for play, for rest, all the things that naturally build those self-regulation muscles.
It definitely makes you think, doesn't it? Maybe a good question for everyone listening is, what's one small change you could realistically make starting today to create just a little more space for self-regulation to grow in a child's life?
Or even reflecting on our own busyness, perhaps, how our own lack of regulation might be impacting the environment around us.
That's a powerful thought to end on, mulling over our own patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for walking us through all of that. It's been incredibly helpful.
My pleasure. It's such an important topic.
And just a heads up for everyone listening, our next deep dive will build on this, exploring practical strategies for actually building emotional balance. So definitely tune in for that.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks again for joining us for this deep dive into self-regulation in a busy world. And thanks to all of you for listening.